Today we're going to be talking about something that is hugely important in the beat production as well as content creation industry that I see a lot of people overlook at first. Now, what I'm referring to here is dynamics. Dynamics is the key to making a beat sound less dull and more engaging, as well as creating visual content that keeps the viewer engaged without him getting bored. But in this video, we're just going to be talking about dynamics and beats. So we're going to be talking about the use of transition sounds, the use of multiple patterns, the use of breaks, and so much more that you can do to keep your beats dynamic and engaging. Also, welcome to the new camera angles. Let me know down in the comments how you like them. Now, with all that being said, let's jump into Ableton and I'll show you what we're working with today.
I hope that I can teach you something new you didn't know. I hope that you support me, help me make this channel grow. I'm putting in the effort, but right now it's moving slow. So if you're interested in learning how to play with sound, then stick around and make that red button blue and check out my other videos. I swear that I won't let you down. Welcome to Trigon Beats, I hope that you stick around.
Alright, so welcome to the second new camera angle. Let's look at Ableton. So as you can see right here in Ableton, I currently have a beat that has 3 parts. I have a hook part right here. I have a sort of bridge pre-verse part, and then I have the actual verse. Now, of course, there's a lot of arrangement left to do in this beat. There's overall a lot of production left to do in this beat. But let's start dynamically connecting these parts together so the transition doesn't just sound like this. Because as you can tell, this was a relatively dull and almost boring transition. There was nothing going on leading into the next part, and as the listener, up until the point where the part switches, you don't even know that anything's changing. Now that is exactly where dynamics come into play. Because essentially what dynamics are so good at is to connect pieces that aren't connected naturally. So you have a hook and you have a verse, and if you just put them right next to each other without anything that's connecting the two, then they're almost going to sound out of place. So with dynamics, like transition sounds for example, you can let the listener know that another part is about to start, you can lead into it, and then it's going to be a much more fluid listening experience. Now the best way we can do this with beats is the use of transition sounds. I cannot understate the importance of using transition sounds. And with transition sounds you can get really creative. You can use anything from cymbal transitions, which is probably one of the most popular ones, to risers, to impact sounds, to all kinds of little perks and effect sounds. So let's take a closer look at the transition between the hook and the verse and add all of those transition sounds to make that a dynamic transition. Okay, so I mentioned this before, but there's one transition sound that is 10 out of 10 times in every single beat that I make, and that is this Cashmere cymbal transition. Now, cymbal transitions are really just a reversed crash cymbal hit swelling into the actual crash cymbal hit. Now you can see even with just as simple as one little transition sound right there, it makes night and day difference. Okay, now for some of these transitions, I also want to layer it up with something that has a little more oomph, so something like an impact sound. So something like that, for example, will give a lot of epicness and will really sell that transition. Now, I wouldn't go too crazy with the transition sounds. If you start adding 4, 5, 6 different sounds for every single transition, be it a minor one or a bigger one, it's just going to sound overproduced and overflowing. So I would say get like 1 or 2 transition sounds like the cymbal transition, maybe something like a swoosh transition to use within your beat, and then layer up some like bigger impact sounds for the more impactful transition. So going from the hook to the verse, for example. But I wouldn't use such a big impact sound for any small transition for a change within the verse or something like that. Now these little swoosh sounds are also actually very helpful. You can mix them in the way that they're so far in the background that the listener does not actively understand what they're hearing right now, but subconsciously they're noticing this little wind movement almost. So I really like using those in smaller transitions, like when you're just switching up the hi-hats a little bit or adding an extra instrument that this can then swoosh into. And then of course even adding things like reverb and other effects can definitely enhance these transition sounds as well. Now another thing that I'd say is really important for the dynamic structure of your beat is adding breaks and part changes. Now what I mean by that is that you should not be afraid to just cut out the hi-hat for 1 bar or for less than that or for little parts. So let's look at the transition between that little bridge part and the verse real quick, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Although we do have those transition sounds in there, it's not quite at the level of dynamics that I would like it to be. So what I'm going to do here is basically cut everything from this snare drum, so that after this snare drum there's nothing else playing, just the transition sound, and then the new part drops. See how that gives you a whole new dimension of that transition, because you could clearly hear this part is now over, now the transition sound comes in, next part drops. So little breaks and pauses like that can really accentuate your beat and underline specific parts before transition actually comes. But at the same time, you can do this with almost every instrument that you want to transition. If you just cut it a little bit before the actual transition happens and takes place, then you can get a lot of extra movement into the beat. Now, last but not least, I want to talk about different parts. Now, what I mean by that is that if you have one 808 8-bar loop, for example, 4-bar loop, anything like that, and you just loop it throughout the entire beat, then you're going to lose out a lot of potential on having a more dynamic beat. The same thing goes for hi-hats, the same thing goes for drums, the same thing goes for all the instruments that you're using, anything like that. So if we look at all the red parts up here, those are all the basses. So we have the 808 in the top track, and then in the second track we have a Reese bass playing. Now notice that I have 3 different parts for the 3 different parts of beat that we have. So right here I have the 808s for the hook, which is a lot faster. It's full time at 180 BPM, whereas the bridge and the verse are half time at 180 BPM, so basically 90. So obviously I'll have separate 808s for the hook and for the verse parts, but then I also for the bridge have a Reese bass that's yet again playing a different bass line. And essentially what that does, it does not allow the listener to get bored by consistently hearing the same repetitive 808s or the same hi-hats or the same drums, whatever. But by kind of throwing some different parts with the same instruments at the listener, it always keeps it fresh, it always keeps the listening experience exciting, because every couple seconds something new is being introduced and they're not being bored by what they've already been hearing for the past 3 minutes. Now, I want to give you one strong example about hi-hats. So this lower turquoise track right here, these are my hi-hats. And if we take a closer look, you can see that in the hook, there is a lot more going on with the hi-hats, whereas in the bridge, I just have quarter notes playing, and in the verse so far, I only have 8th notes playing. Now, I want to show you what that verse sounds like with just the 8th note hi-hats playing, and then I'm going to switch it out to the hi-hats that I made for the hook that are already way more detailed and more dynamic. And then we will see what the difference sounds like, because as per usual, this beat is still a work in progress, so stuff isn't done yet. But let's take a listen what the difference sounds like. Okay, so I think it was clear that this hi-hat pattern was not made for the verse, it was made for the hook, and just for the sake of this video I just popped it over real quick. But I think that you can still hear the same effect, that right now it's a lot more dynamic in the hi-hats, and it doesn't sound as repetitive as it did when we just had the 8th notes in there. Now this is basically how I would produce a track. What I do is I start with really basic parts, like just straight 8th note hi-hats, and then later on, once I have more tracks, that's when I start going back to the hi-hats and adjusting and improving and optimizing them to be more detailed like that. And again, this is something that you can do with every single instrument and every single part, and it'll greatly increase your dynamic in your tracks and therefore make a more fluid listening experience. Alright, so that was basically what I had to say when it comes to dynamics in beats. While watching this video, you may or may not even have picked up a few things that I do on the content creation on the video front to keep my videos dynamic and interesting and fast-paced. If you're interested in me making a full video about how I make these videos more dynamic and all those things, let me know down in the comments. I'm always a little eerie because I'm not sure if y'all are more interested in audio production and beat making and all those things, or if something like content creation and keeping up a YouTube channel is also something that you'd be interested in. So let me know down in the comments. I definitely appreciate your feedback. Now, with all that being said, I know that this wasn't the be-all end-all about how dynamics work and how you should make your beats more dynamic, but I'm pretty sure that there's some people out there who needed to hear something like this. So if you have a producer friend that maybe struggles a little bit with getting these dynamics right in their beats, send him this video. Let him take a look at it. Maybe they learn something from it. Hopefully you learned something from this. If you did, feel free to let me know down in the comments below, as well as if you have any questions. I'm always down there, so just hit me up. And with all that being said, I hope that you enjoyed this week's video, and then I will see you next week on Tuesday. Peace!